Judge Judy thought she was hearing a simple $50 parking dispute, but the 84-year-old woman standing before her was carrying secrets so powerful it would bring the entire courtroom to tears. Before watching this emotional courtroom case review, powerful, make sure you subscribe to the channel first, comment below where you're watching from, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Now let's begin. Powerful. What I'm about to show you was Judge Judy's final case before she walked away from television forever, and it became one of the most emotional courtroom moments ever captured on TV. Powerful. An 84-year-old woman entered Judge Judy's courtroom over a $50 parking dispute. On paper, it looked ordinary, but when Judge Judy discovered what this grandmother had been secretly carrying in her shopping cart for decades, powerful. Something happened that had never happened in 25 years of her show. Judge Judy stopped the case, stepped away from the bench, and broke down in front of everyone. This is not a normal courtroom story. Powerful. The secret inside that shopping cart was so heartbreaking and so powerful that it forced Judge Judy to make a decision nobody on her production team expected. When the cameras saw what Margaret James had protected for all those years, powerful. The crew did not even know whether to keep filming or stop the show completely. Margaret James was not just an elderly woman with a small legal complaint. Powerful. She had been carrying something connected to one of the most tragic days in American history. For more than 2 decades, she had quietly guarded a secret so meaningful that when Judge Judy finally understood it, powerful, every rule of the courtroom seemed to disappear. But the most shocking part was not only what Margaret had hidden, it was what she had been doing with it every single day. When Judge Judy realized the true purpose behind Margaret's mission, powerful, she did something her producers thought was impossible. She threw out the case, walked into the audience, and allowed something to happen on camera that had never been captured in her courtroom before. This was not just another case. Powerful. This became Judge Judy's final masterpiece. It was a reminder of compassion, quiet service, and the kind of hidden heroism that ordinary people carry without asking for attention. Powerful. Margaret's shopping cart held something so sacred that it transformed Judge Judy from television's toughest courtroom judge into a human being overwhelmed by emotion. It was a Tuesday morning in November, powerful, and the Judge Judy studio in Los Angeles was filled with the usual pre-show energy. The audience was packed with families, tourists, powerful, and curious viewers who had traveled from across the country to watch Judge Judy deliver her famous no-nonsense justice in person. Bailiff Petrie Hawkins Bird moved through his normal routine, powerful, checking papers and preparing the courtroom for another day. The cameras were set in place to catch every reaction, every raised eyebrow, and every sharp response from Judge Judy. Powerful. No one in that studio knew they were about to witness television history. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Judge Judy Sheindlin entered the courtroom for what would unknowingly become her final case. At 81 years old, powerful, she had handled thousands of disputes with the same sharp mind and direct honesty that made her famous. She sat behind the bench, adjusted her glasses, powerful, and looked across the crowded room with the piercing stare that had intimidated countless plaintiffs and defendants. The energy in the room felt electric, like it always did before she began, but this morning carried something different. Powerful. No one could explain it yet. The bailiff announced the final case of the morning, James versus Morrison, a simple parking dispute involving $50 in damage. On the docket, powerful. It looked like the kind of matter Judge Judy could finish in less than 5 minutes. But nothing about this case would stay simple. The plaintiff was Margaret James, an 84-year-old retired seamstress from Chinatown. Powerful. The defendant was Robert Morrison, a 45-year-old construction worker accused of damaging Margaret's car during a parking lot disagreement. Then Margaret entered the courtroom. Immediately, something felt different. She moved slowly. Powerful. But with dignity, using a simple wooden cane that looked hand-carved. She wore modest layers. A faded floral dress, a worn cardigan, and comfortable shoes that looked like they had carried her through thousands of miles. Powerful. Her grey hair was pulled neatly into a bun. Even with her age and simple appearance, she carried herself with quiet strength. But what caught everyone's attention was not only Margaret, it was what she pulled behind her. Powerful. Margaret brought an old shopping cart into the courtroom. It looked like a grocery cart, but it had been reinforced with extra wheels and metal strapping. A clean white sheet covered it completely, tucked carefully around whatever was inside. Powerful. Margaret kept one on the cart at all times. She never let it drift away. She never let it bump into anyone. The way she protected it made one thing clear. Whatever was inside was not just important to her, it was sacred. Powerful. As Margaret reached the plaintiff's podium, Judge Judy noticed something immediately. Despite Margaret's modest circumstances, she had a sense of purpose that could not be faked. She removed a small worn hat, looked directly at Judge Judy, powerful, and stood as straight as her aged body allowed. There was no fear in her eyes, only calm strength. Judge Judy looked down at her paperwork, then back at Margaret, powerful. Her courtroom instincts told her that this was not simply a case about a parking lot. The way Margaret guarded the shopping cart, the way she stood beside it, and the emotional weight in her presence suggested something much deeper, powerful. The audience felt it too. The room grew unusually quiet. Even the camera operators seemed more focused, as if everyone could sense that something important was about to happen. Powerful. Margaret James stood at the podium with one hand on her cane and the other still holding the shopping cart. She looked at Judge Judy with eyes that seemed to carry decades of pain, memory, and purpose, and in that moment, powerful. Judge Judy realized she was looking at a woman who had lived through more than anyone in that room could imagine. The case may have been listed as a $50 parking dispute, powerful, but Judge Judy's instincts told her the real story was much larger than the damage to a bumper. Margaret James, Judge Judy began in her usual direct tone, powerful. You are here claiming that Mr. Morrison damaged your vehicle in a parking lot altercation. You are asking for $50. Tell me exactly what happened. Margaret adjusted her grip on her cane and kept her other hand firmly on the shopping cart handle. Powerful. She did not let the cart move even an inch away from her. Your Honor, she said softly, though her voice carried surprising strength, I was parked outside the community centre on Grant Street. Powerful. Mr. Morrison's truck backed into my car and dented the bumper. When I asked him for insurance information, he became aggressive and told me to get lost. Judge Judy turned toward the defendant. Robert Morrison was a large construction worker, powerful, about 45 years old, and he looked uncomfortable standing in front of her. He shifted his weight and avoided looking directly at Margaret. Mr. Morrison, Judge Judy said, your version? He sighed with irritation. Look, Your Honor, powerful. It was barely anything. This old lady came out making a huge scene about her ancient car. I offered her $20, but she wanted to call the police and turn it into a big production. Judge Judy's expression hardened. Powerful. She had spent decades watching people dismiss the elderly, the poor, and the quiet simply because they assumed those people had no power. Morrison's tone told her almost as much as his words. James, Judge Judy said, powerful. Turning back to Margaret, how old is your car? Margaret straightened slightly. It is a 1995 Honda Civic, Your Honor. I have owned it for 28 years. It is not worth much money, but it takes me where I need to go. And where do you need to go? Powerful. Judge Judy asked. For the first time, Margaret's calm expression shifted. A quiet emotion moved across her face. Every day, Your Honor, she said, I drive to different places around the city. It is important work. Powerful. I have been doing it for many years and I cannot miss a day. Judge Judy leaned forward. Her curiosity was no longer casual. James, may I ask how old you are? 84, Your Honor, Margaret replied. The same age as you, I believe. Powerful. That answer stopped Judge Judy for a moment. Two 84-year-old women stood in the same courtroom, both still serving in their own way, but from completely different worlds. One sat behind the bench as one of the most famous judges in television. Powerful. The other stood at a podium with a cane, an old car, a small claim, and a covered shopping cart she would not release from her hand. Judge Judy looked again at the cart. You said you do important work every day, she said slowly. Powerful. What kind of work requires you to drive around the city with what appears to be very precious cargo? Margaret's grip tightened around the cart handle for the first time. She looked vulnerable. Your Honor, she said. Powerful. It is difficult to explain. People may not understand the importance of what I carry. Judge Judy stood from the bench. The courtroom shifted instantly. Everyone knew this was unusual. Powerful. Judge Judy rarely left her position unless something had captured her full attention. But now she walked around to the front, closing the distance between herself and Margaret. James, she said, her voice softer. Margaret, powerful. I have done this for a quarter of a century, and I can tell when a person is carrying something more important than a parking dispute. What is inside that shopping cart? Margaret's entire posture changed. Powerful. Her hand gripped the cart almost desperately. She moved slightly, placing her body more protectively between the cart and the courtroom. Powerful. The white sheet over the contents suddenly seemed less like a cover and more like a veil over something sacred. Her eyes filled with tears. "Your Honor," she whispered, "it is very personal, nothing illegal, nothing dangerous." Powerful. "Just things that matter more to me than my own life." The courtroom became completely silent. Judge Judy's expression softened from curiosity into genuine concern. She records the emotional weight in Margaret's words. "Margaret, powerful," she said gently, "I am not asking only as a judge right now, as I am asking as one 84-year-old woman to another. What could be so precious that you cannot let it out of your sight for even a moment?" Margaret looked around the courtroom. Powerful. She saw the audience, the cameras, the bright lights, and the people waiting for her answer. Her hand trembled slightly. "People will think I am a crazy old woman," Margaret said. "Some people already have." Powerful. "They do not understand what I am trying to do. They do not understand what I have done every day for decades." Judge Judy's stepped closer and her voice became warmer than anyone in that courtroom was used to hearing. "Margaret, powerful. In 25 years on this bench, I have learned that people who dedicate their lives to something others do not understand are often the sanest people in the room. Whatever you are protecting, whatever mission you have given your life to, powerful. I promise you this courtroom will treat it with respect." Margaret looked directly into Judge Judy's eyes, searching for sincerity. After a long pause, she nodded. "Your Honor," she said quietly. "Powerful. What I am about to show you will explain why losing my car for even one day would be a tragedy. It will explain why I drive to different places every morning, and why I have spent so many years on a mission most people cannot comprehend." Powerful. Her trembling hand moved toward the white sheet. "But you must understand," she continued, "what is inside this cart represents the most sacred trust anyone has ever given me." Judge Judy stood still. Powerful. And everyone in the courtroom understood they were about to witness something that would change the entire meaning of the case. Margaret took one final breath and slowly pulled back the clean white sheet from the shopping cart. Powerful. As the fabric fell away, the entire courtroom gasped. Inside the cart were hundreds of carefully preserved photographs. Each one had been laminated, placed in a clear protective sleeve, and organized with extraordinary care. Powerful. But these were not ordinary pictures. They were portraits of firefighters, police officers, paramedics, military personnel, and civilians, all smiling with the life and energy of people who had no idea their final day was coming. Your Honor, powerful. These are the 343 firefighters, 72 police officers, 55 military personnel, and 2,097 innocent people who died on September 11th, 2001. I have carried their pictures, their stories, powerful, and their memory every day for 22 years. Judge Judy's eyes widened. Margaret began lifting out photographs one by one. "This is Lieutenant Michael Warkola from Ladder Company 5, she said, powerful, holding up a laminated picture of a firefighter smiling at the camera. He was 51 years old. He had 3 children. He died saving people on the 40th floor of the North Tower. Then she picked up another photo, and this is Officer Moira Smith. Powerful, the first police officer to report the World Trade Center attack. She died leading people to safety." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. Judge Judy stepped closer, tears forming as the true scale of Margaret's mission became clear. Powerful. Each photograph had a small card attached with the occupation, age on, and one personal detail about their life. Margaret had not only preserved their images, she had preserved their humanity. "Your Honor," Margaret said, "powerful. I know people think I am just an old Chinese woman with a cart full of pictures, but these heroes deserve to be remembered every day. Their families deserve to know someone still carries their memory and honors their sacrifice." Powerful. Then Margaret reached deeper into the cart and pulled out organized notebooks filled with handwritten stories, letters from families, and details about each person's life and final moments. Powerful. Judge Judy realized she was looking at one of the most complete mobile memorials to 9/11 victims ever created by a single person. But Margaret was not finished. She carefully removed a worn manila envelope from the deepest part of the cart. Powerful. Your Honor, she said softly, this will break your heart. Inside were copies of last voicemails, final text messages, and goodbye letters shared by families who wanted their loved ones' final words to become part of the memorial. Powerful. Judge Judy took the envelope with trembling hands. Then Margaret gave the revelation that left everyone frozen. Every morning for 22 years, I drive to a different place where these heroes lived, worked, or spent time. I set up their pictures. Powerful. I tell their stories to anyone willing to listen. I visited neighborhoods, fire stations, police precincts, and community centers. I am their guardian, and I will be until I die. Powerful. Judge Judy stared at the memorial collection for a long moment without speaking. Tears streamed on her face. In 25 years, the courtroom had never seen her like this. Judge Judy had been angry, sharp, impatient, amused, and fierce. Powerful. But she had never been this visibly overwhelmed by emotion. She wiped her eyes and looked at Margaret with deep reverence. Then she did something unprecedented. She walked to the bailiff and whispered something in his ear. Powerful. He immediately stopped the formal proceedings. The cameras remained on. But everyone understood that Judge Judy had just made a decision that broke the usual rules of her show. She returned to Margaret and spoke with awe in her voice. Powerful. Margaret James, in 25 years on this bench, I have never met anyone who dedicated their life to something so pure, so selfless, and so sacred. Then Judge Judy turned toward Robert Morrison, powerful, who now looked ashamed and was wiping tears from his own eyes. Mr. Morrison, she said, her familiar strength returning, you will pay Mrs. James if not $50. Powerful. You will personally drive her wherever she needs to go for the next month while her car is repaired, and you will spend one full day helping her set up this memorial so you can understand what real service looks like. Powerful. But Judge Judy was still not finished. She removed her judicial robe, stepped away from the bench, and walked into the audience. Then she asked Margaret to set up the memorial right there in the studio. For the next hour, powerful. With cameras still rolling, Judge Judy helped Margaret display the photographs of 9/11 victims while Margaret told their stories to the audience. Finally, Judge Judy looked at Margaret and said, powerful. You are the most honorable person who has ever appeared in my courtroom. Then she dismissed the case, not because of a technical legal point, but because she refused to let anything interfere with Margaret's sacred mission. Powerful. The studio audience rose into the longest standing ovation of Judge Judy's career. That moment changed everything. The courtroom was no longer focused on a parking dispute. Powerful. The $50 claim had become almost meaningless compared to what Margaret James had brought into that room. Everyone had entered expecting another fast ruling from Judge Judy. Powerful, but they were now standing inside a living memorial built by one woman's quiet devotion. Margaret carefully arranged the photographs one by one. She did not rush. Powerful. Each picture was handled with the same tenderness most people reserve for family heirlooms. She placed firefighters beside police officers, civilians beside paramedics, powerful, military personnel beside ordinary workers who had simply gone to work that morning and never returned home. Judge Judy helped her silently. There was no sharp courtroom banter now, no sarcastic remark, no impatience. Powerful. Just two elderly women standing together under studio lights, treating every photograph like a life that still deserved to be remembered. The audience watched without speaking. Some people cried openly. Others covered their mouths. Powerful. Overwhelmed by the weight of what Margaret had carried for so many years. Even the crew members, trained to stay professional no matter what happened, were wiping their eyes behind the cameras. Powerful. Robert Morrison stood at the defendant's podium looking completely different from the man who had first dismissed Margaret as just an old woman with an ancient car. His shoulders had dropped. His face was pale. The irritation was gone, powerful, replaced by shame. For the first time, he seemed to understand why Margaret's car mattered. It was not transportation for errands. It was transportation for remembrance. That Honda Civic was how Margaret kept thousands of names alive. Powerful. Every morning, she drove somewhere connected to the people whose photographs filled her cart. She set up the memorial in neighborhoods, outside fire stations, near police precincts, at community centers, powerful, and in places where ordinary people could stop, look, and remember. She had spent 22 years making sure that the victims of September 11th were not reduced to a number. They had names, families' dreams, final phone calls, favourite meals, powerful, children tocrants, lives that mattered, and Margaret had carried all of that alone. When the studio audience finally rose, the applause did not feel like entertainment, it felt like gratitude. It was long, emotional, and impossible to stop. Powerful. People were not clapping for a television moment. They were clapping for a woman who had given 2 years of her life to remembrance without asking for fame, money, or recognition. Judge Judy stood beside Margaret with tears still in her eyes. Powerful. Then she made the announcement no one expected. She said this would be her final case. The courtroom went silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was not shock from conflict, it was awe. Powerful. Judge Judy explained that after seeing Margaret's dedication, after witnessing such pure service and compassion, she could not imagine ending her career on any case more meaningful than this one. For 25 years, Judge Judy had handled disputes, powerful, lies, arguments, unpaid debts, broken agreements, and human conflict. But Margaret's case reminded her why justice mattered in the first place. Justice was not only about deciding who owed money, it was about recognizing dignity. Powerful. It was about honoring people who had served something larger than themselves. It was about making sure the world did not overlook the quiet heroes standing right in front of it. 3 days after the episode, powerful, Judge Judy officially announced her retirement from television. The entertainment industry was stunned. Producers, executives, viewers, powerful. And critics all tried to understand how a $50 parking dispute had become the final case of the most successful courtroom show in television history. But Judge Judy's explanation was simple, powerful. Margaret James had reminded her that the greatest cases are not always the biggest legal battles. Sometimes the most important case is the one that shows the deepest truth about humanity. After the episode aired, powerful. Margaret's life changed in a way she had never expected. Visitors across America began reaching out. Some wanted to donate, some wanted to volunteer. Powerful. Some were relatives of 9/11 victims who had seen their loved ones' photographs in Margaret's cart and realized this elderly woman had been carrying their memory for years. A GoFundMe campaign was created to help Margaret continue her mission. Powerful. It raised more than $2 million, enough to build a permanent memorial center in Lower Manhattan where Margaret's photographs, notebooks, letters, and stories could be displayed every day. 1 year after her Judge Judy appearance, powerful, the Margaret James Memorial Center opened. Margaret, now 85, still worked there 6 days a week, telling the stories she had spent more than 2 decades protecting. The Margaret James Memorial Center became more than a building. Powerful. It became the permanent home of a mission that one elderly woman had carried alone for more than 2 decades. Visitors came from across the country to see the photographs, read the handwritten stories, powerful, and listen as Margaret spoke each name with the care of someone protecting a sacred promise. Families of September 11th victims began visiting the center like a pilgrimage. Some came with flowers, some brought letters. Powerful. Some stood quietly in front of the photographs, crying because they realized their loved ones had not been forgotten by a stranger who had carried their memory every single day. For many of them, Margaret was not just a volunteer. Powerful. She was a guardian. She had kept their sons, daughters, husbands, wives, parents, friends, and co-workers alive in the public memory long after the headlines faded. She had made sure their stories were not reduced to numbers. Powerful. She remembered birthdays, she remembered occupations, she remembered final calls, favourite jokes, and the small human details that made each life unique. Judge Judy attended the opening ceremony of the Memorial Center. Powerful, and her speech brought thousands of people to tears. She said that in all her years of delivering justice, she had never met anyone who represented true justice the way Margaret James did. Powerful. Margaret had spent 22 years serving people who could never thank her in person. She had honoured families who still carried grief. She had reminded the country that remembrance is not something we do once a year, it is something we choose to carry. Powerful. Judge Judy called Margaret's case the most important case of her entire career, not because it involved a large amount of money, not because it included a complicated legal argument, powerful, but because it taught her that real justice is not always about who wins or loses in court. Sometimes real justice means recognizing the people who quietly make the world better and giving them the honor they never asked for. Powerful. The Memorial Centre has now been visited by hundreds of thousands of people from around the world. Children walk through the exhibits and learn about courage, not from textbooks, but from Margaret's voice. Powerful. Firefighters visit and stand silently before the names of those who ran in. Police officers, paramedics, veterans, teachers, and ordinary families all leave understanding something deeper about sacrifice. And every day, powerful, Margaret continues her mission. Now she no longer has to pull the cart through the city alone. Volunteers help her, families support her, visitors listen. But the heart of the memorial remains the same. Powerful. One woman refusing to let heroes disappear into history. That is what made Judge Judy's final case so unforgettable. It started with a parking dispute, a dented bumper, a $50 claim. Powerful. A construction worker who dismissed an elderly woman's old car as unimportant, but it ended by revealing that the car was part of a mission bigger than anyone in that room could have imagined. Powerful. That old Honda Civic carried Margaret from one memory to the next. It took her to neighborhoods, fire stations, police precincts, and community centers. It allowed her to tell stories that might otherwise fade. Powerful. Robert Morrison eventually spent that day helping Margaret set up the memorial, just as Judge Judy ordered. By the end of it, he was no longer the same man who had walked into court. He apologized to Margaret with tears in his eyes. Powerful. Admitting that he had seen only an old woman and an old car, not the sacred work she was trying to protect, Margaret accepted the apology quietly. Then she handed him a photograph and told him the story behind it. That was Margaret's way. Powerful. She did not shame people. She taught them to remember, and that is why her story touched millions, because in a world that moves too fast, Margaret chose to slow down. In a world that forgets quickly, she chose to remember. Powerful. In a world that often celebrates fame, power, and noise, she showed that the deepest kind of heroism can be quiet, repetitive, and almost invisible. Judge Judy's final words from that case carried the meaning of her entire career. Powerful. Real justice is not only about the law, it is about seeing people clearly. It is about recognizing dignity. It is about honoring those who serve without applause. Powerful. Margaret James proved that one ordinary person can carry thousands of memories with nothing but love, discipline, and devotion. She showed that remembrance is an act of service. She showed that heroism is not always one dramatic moment. Powerful. Sometimes it is showing up every morning for 22 years because someone has to keep saying the names. So now I want to ask you the same question this story leaves in every heart. Powerful. Who is someone in your life who deserves recognition for quiet dedication? Who helps others without asking for praise? Who keeps showing up day after day for something bigger than themselves? Tell their story in the comments. Powerful. Because Margaret James reminds us that the world is full of hidden heroes. People who carry pain with grace, people who honor others in silence, people who make the world better without ever asking the world to notice. Powerful. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that extraordinary dedication still exists in ordinary people. Like this video if you believe our heroes deserve to be honored, our elders deserve to be respected. Powerful. And every human being deserves dignity. Sibrans for more stories that prove compassion still matters, remembrance still matters, and human decency can still change everything. Rest in peace to every hero Margaret carried in her cart. Powerful. And thank you, Margaret James, for showing the world what 22 years of unwavering love truly looks like.